Britain is really intense for accents, right? It's a relatively small island, quite heavily populated, always has been in comparison to other nations, and yet we have a huge variety of accents packed into that small space. Everything from the received pronunciation of the BBC through to the long drawn out words of Somerset and all points in between. Hampshire Ogs, your Cockney Gazers, all of it. Now, it didn't just used to be accent, it used to be slang, and even going from one village to another, there would be a huge change in the kind of language and words that people were using, to the point where the local language could be almost incomprehensible to someone even from 50 miles away. That's how bad it used to be. Even slang for common items would be very different. And this changed, or began to change, with the advent of the railway. Suddenly people were mixing more, they were moving around. Also the idea of a local time really changed. There was a point where, one town or one village had the time set to a particular time, and another town or another village would have their clock set to a different time altogether, and as you travelled you would have to constantly reassign your clock to the local time. Much worse than the time zones we currently have to deal with, and much worse than the changes between summertime and wintertime and so on. But that travel began to break down the language barrier, and then as radio and television came along and the idea of BBC English or received pronunciation took hold, suddenly we were all speaking a much more common language, even though slang and certainly accents have retained a certain amount of locality, a way of identifying people who are members of your tribe and so on, but still we had a common language. I spend a lot of time, relatively speaking, on this channel talking about how I am trying to communicate with people outside of my bubble, and I don't succeed really very much. That's why part of the reason I always say, you'll try, you'll fail, occasionally you'll succeed, but it's such an overwhelming degree of failure to try and communicate with people that it can be quite disheartening. This is why I also talk about the value of semantics. People will often dismiss an argument as a semantic argument, as though the meaning of words didn't matter somehow, and yet we can't communicate at all if we can't agree on the meaning of words. And this is where the problem comes in, because while we now have the internet, which is a kind of progress of that railway, telegraph, radio, television, that has allowed us all to communicate much more easily and to have a common language, with the internet we seem to have divided ourselves up into camps, and there is no facilitation of that common language. So I can use a term which means something to me, and it will be received entirely differently or rejected completely by someone else. Let's take a good example, right? Racism. When I talk about racism, I mean prejudice on the basis of race, and that can be from any race to any other race. All it is prejudice on the basis of race. That is it. If you hate white people, you're racist. If you hate black people, you're racist. If you hate Jews, you're racist. If you hate Arabs, you're racist. If you hate Chinese people, you're racist, and so on and so on and so on. This is the common understanding of the term, right? That racism is prejudice on the basis of race. It may or may not include an element of racial superiority for your own race. If I use the word racism and I'm trying to have a discussion with someone on the far left, they don't understand the term racism to mean prejudice on the basis of race. They take it to mean the abuse of power from one race over another. So they say that power has to be part of the definition, even though that's a very narrow subset of one academic definition. So if I say the Nation of Islam is racist, that's the black pseudo Scientology for black people. Basically, if I say that their beliefs are racist, that person on the far left will object. Black people can't be racist under their definition because they don't have the institutional power or whatever else to do so. But they hate white people. They think there's some kind of evil mutation created by an evil mastermind. If that's not racist, I don't know what is, but they will refuse that common understanding, that common definition of the term racism, and so communication breaks down. On the far right, if they're being racist, and I point out that they're being racist in that common understanding of the term, they will object. They will start to accuse you of being a social justice warrior, even though you're using the definition correctly to describe prejudice against race. And also there's various conspiracy theories, like Trotsky came up with the term, or someone else came up with the term to discredit their enemies. No, it's a descriptive term that has gone by other names in the past. And when you come at me and you say something like, oh well, see how you like it when the white traitor whores are breeding with the black beasts of the field, that's racist. You might be trolling, you might be insincere. I've seen similar sentiments expressed by people who were being sincere. That is racist. There is no getting around that. No naturalistic fallacy will excuse you here. That is prejudice on the basis of race, and it has zero foundation in reality. Democracy is another one. People don't understand the term. They don't understand the term colloquially. They certainly don't understand it politically. How often have you heard someone in the States say, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, as if the two were somehow incompatible? But what they often mean by democracy is direct democracy, or mob rule, which more properly is called ochlocracy. And obviously you're not that. You're a republic. All that means is you don't have a king or queen. It's a form of government without a monarch. That's what a republic is. Perhaps modelled somewhat on the great Greek and Roman republics, since you have a senate, perhaps, but that's a particular republic, a Congress and Senate republic, not republic in general. And you're a democracy to whatever extent you can be said to be a democracy, because you vote. It's a representative democracy. It's also a republic. It's also a constitutional republic. It can be all these things. None of these things conflict with each other. Recently I had someone say that Britain wasn't a democracy. I have slightly more sympathy for that, since we have a House of Lords and a monarchy and so on, but we do still vote. So we are still a democracy. We're a constitutional monarchy and a democracy. These two things are not in conflict. But there's no real capacity to have the conversations that you need to have in order to humanize yourself in these people's eyes, and to humanize them in your eyes, to come to some kind of mutual understanding or compromise, even if it's just, okay, you're allowed to express your views, but not to enforce them. That's a compromise position. But there's no opportunity to do that if you can't communicate with people. And for whatever reason, our ability to communicate is becoming balkanized, and it's becoming harder and harder to communicate across lines because people simply aren't speaking the same language. And even what I do, which is to define my terms and say what I mean by these words, is being rejected. So how do you facilitate communication? How do you engage in that humanization process when you can't even agree on the function of basic language? And that's why semantics are really, really important. Zang.